Ladies and gentlemen, this is the re-recording of Lecture 10 in the Popper and Critical Rationalism series. It's being re-recorded because there were internet problems when the lecture was originally given. The title of this lecture is The Limits to Reason, Part 2. I've earlier documented Popper's initial views about there being limits to reason, and the way in which his views about what is discussable shifted so as in his later work to include the idea that metaphysical theories, which he always thought were meaningful and important, fell, in his view, in his later work, into the category of what can be open to critical discussion. Today's topic is rather different and involves several interconnected problems. One starting point is with the early Popper, who became disillusioned with Marxism and who at the same time was also reading the Danish philosopher Kierkegaard. In Alistair MacIntyre's A Short History of Ethics, in fact, in chapter 16, he discusses one issue raised by Kierkegaard in the following terms. Suppose one believes one's moral position can be rationally justified. This means that one can justify it from certain premises, but these premises then have to be justified, and so on. The chain of reasons must have an ending. We must reach the point where we simply choose to stand by certain premises. At this point, decision has replaced argument. This analysis, however, can then be applied to rationalism itself. That's to say, rationalism might be understood in various ways. For example, as an openness to or a dependence on argument. But what about rationalism itself? Can rationalism itself be justified? Or must it, after the fashion of Kierkegaard's analysis, itself rest on some kind of commitment? Must at this point decision replace argument? This kind of problem arises in two contexts in Popper's work. First, he reports on at some point remonstrating with a Nazi and getting a response back along the following lines. I will dramatize this a bit. These are my words, not his. Argument, the Nazi might say, is a Jewish disease. When people start talking about argument, I reach for my pistol. There are, however, three issues here. First, is there anything that can compel the Nazi not to use his pistol, but to reason instead? On the face of it, there's no argument that will do this. Second, is his position on a par with Popper's? The answer here seems to me to be no. Why? Well, first, one might claim that human knowledge is fallible. And in the face of our fallibility, there would seem to be every reason to be open to argument and to critical input from other people. This requires rationality, but this then seems to be an option from which the Nazi is arbitrarily closing himself off. Second, however, there's a sense in which the Nazi is doing something rather strange, for he is likely himself to make use of reason and argument in a routine way. After all, suppose that he wished to burn a copy of Popper's The Logic of Scientific Discovery. He would have to make instrumental use of reason to draw the content out of his idea, to say, well, if I want to do this, then I have to do the following. He might well engage in argument, too, with a fellow Nazi. Pass me the petrol can, he might say to the other guy. "But this can is in fact full of water," his companion might respond. Clearly, there may be situations in which one puts rational argument to one side. For example, if there's an emergency, stopping then to open one's proposed actions to criticism could well simply make matters worse. Or if criticism seems unfruitful, if one has from somebody, say, received simply a string of silly and unhelpful criticisms of one's views. Obviously, there is a risk here that one might do the wrong thing, but a suspension in such circumstances of openness to criticism seems really quite reasonable. There is, however, a deeper issue in Popper's work here. It is that in his open society, he seems as if echoing the lesson that MacIntyre wished us to draw from Kierkegaard, to suggest that the rationalist must make a non-rational commitment to reason. Compare in this context the Open Society, chapter 24, section 2, and I quote, "Whoever adopts the rationalist attitude does so because he's adopted some proposal or decision or belief or behavior, an adoption which may be called irrational." And Popper also writes of, I quote, "an irrational faith in reason." You might recall that in an earlier lecture, I mentioned that when Popper as a young man became disillusioned with Marxism, he seemed under the influence of Kierkegaard to exhibit some skepticism about reason itself. He wrote briefly about this in a draft of an autobiography held at the Hoover Institution archives and a copy of it at Klagenfurt. This material is discussed briefly by Cohen, although he tends to stress other aspects of it, and also by Bartley in the one chapter that we have from Bartley's projected biography of Popper. This issue became a concern of Bill Bartley's. By contrast with Popper, Bartley had a live interest in religious issues, which led him to some interesting questions about this aspect of rationalism. He wrote his PhD thesis, the bulk of which was published as his most interesting book, Retreat to Commitment, on these very issues. And he also published several papers about them. One interesting source is his Rationality versus the Theory of Rationality, which is in Mario Bunge's Festschrift for Popper, The Critical Approach. I'll provide other references in the lecture notes. And here is a picture of Bill Bartley, alas, for a while now, no longer with us. A useful way to get into all of this is by way of Bartley's analysis of types of rationalism. He noted that some rationalists had made statements along the lines that a rationalist is someone who will only hold views if they're rationally justified. This is what Bartley called comprehensive rationalism. Bartley noted that, for reasons familiar enough to readers of Popper on Fries's trilemma, as well as to readers of Kierkegaard, this doesn't work. A second view was that rationalism had simply to be assumed. One could then consistently be a rationalist. This, because Bartley considered that this view was to be found at some points in Popper, he called critical rationalism, but it's a view that he discerned in the work of many other people as well. Bartley, however, raised the following problem about it. There were various religious fideists who took the view that one had initially to make a religious commitment within which one could then make use of reason. Bartley argued that those rationalists who thought one needed to make a commitment to reason were on problematic ground. The reason for this was that if they advanced any criticism of the fideists, these people could respond to them in Latin, tu quoque, or in English, you too. That's to say, they could claim that their views were symmetrical with those of the rationalists. Each of them was simply making a commitment, so that the rationalists had no basis on which to criticize them because essentially they were in the same boat as them. I think that there is indeed a problem here, but I'm not sure nonetheless that there is a complete parallel between the positions. For the rationalist could surely say, look, I'd agree that we each make a commitment, but mine is simply to the use of reason, whereas yours is to a substantive theological position, and then to the use of reason in its explication, its discussion, and to critical appraisal of ideas within your position. There are commitments, to be sure, but yours is more problematic than mine. Why? Well, just because each of them seem to be making use of reason, but the fideist is saying, but I'm, as it were, also making a commitment to my substantive theological position. That being said, Bartley had, I think, highlighted a real problem. As to say, that was something problematic about a rationalist depending on a non-rational assumption of rationalism. It seems to me that Bartley is best understood as having resolved the problem in two stages. First, Bartley brought out a theme that we've already noted in Popper, namely Popper's rejection of justificationist argument. That's to say, Popper, in fact, has a response to Kierkegaard. It is that the problem in Kierkegaard is posed by the equation of rationality with justification. However, if one ditches the idea of justification and instead proposes that rationality be equated with openness to criticism, Kierkegaard's problem is actually resolved. The second strand of Bartley's response is to argue that one does not, in consequence, need to make the fideist-looking move made by Popper in the Open Society. For, Bartley argued, one can advance what he called comprehensively critical rationalism, or CCR. The idea here is that one proposes that rationality be equated with openness to criticism, and then indeed claims that CCR can be applied to itself. That's to say, it's claimed that it is open to criticism and that it would be damaged if it could be shown that it is not, in fact, open to criticism. Where, of course, one needs to bear in mind that openness to criticism is not the same thing as it's actually being faulty. While if the criticism is effective, we'll need to reject or modify the view with which we started. Bartley's ideas, however, were themselves criticized. One interesting line of criticism was offered by John Watkins, who was working in the philosophy department at the LSE. He argued essentially that it looks as if Bartley's challenge, show that CCR can't be criticized, is in fact bogus. Why? Well, suppose that someone was able to advance a criticism that CCR was uncriticizable. What would they have done? Well, it would appear that they would have criticized CCR, which in turn would show that CCR is open to criticism. Watkins' argument was thus that there's something problematic about this very challenge, and thus about CCR. There was interesting back and forth about this and other related issues. A key source is Bartley and Radnitsky's collection, Evolutionary Epistemology, Rationality, and the Sociology of Knowledge, which includes a number of papers that are critical of Bartley and also some responses by Bartley. Another useful source is the second edition of Bartley's book, Retreat to Commitment. It's always seemed to me personally, and indeed since I was an undergraduate student, that there was in principle an easy enough response to this. I actually voiced it in a seminar or tutorial group which Watkins was running for undergraduate students. I had in advance discussed this with another chap, a man called Karl Theodor, who went on to qualify as an economist and has had a distinguished career in Trinidad. And I mentioned in the tutorial group, well, I discussed this with Karl. Watkins was really quite surprised because Karl for him meant Karl Popper, and he wondered if I'd been talking to Popper about this, which clearly I hadn't. My thought was that a simple response from Bartley's side would be to argue that the fact that someone showed that CCR was not open to criticism, if that indeed could be done, should not itself count as a criticism of CCR in the relevant sense. One might instead call it a criticism of the claim that CCR was an adequate theory of rationality. In one sense, making such a move is obviously ad hoc, but in another, it would seem to me an perfectly innocuous move to make, as it simply served to bar the move which Watkins had been talking about, which had caused the problem. And this wasn't something that one wished to occur at all. By making this exclusion, one was in fact making sure that CCR itself was more genuinely criticizable. It seems to me that Bartley's approach was a very useful one. On the one side, it serves to remove something that in Popper's writings was really rather odd. On the other side, it serves to bring out the anti-justificationist character of a Popperian approach to epistemology. I also think that it addresses a significant issue, namely, is rationalism in the same boat as religious fideism? Does it face the same problem? And suggests that the answer is no. Although it would be interesting if there could be a response to this by fideists. For example, what of a non-justificationist fideism, which applied its own distinctive standards to itself? It seems to me also to add to the initial response that I earlier offered to the pistol problem. That's to say, not only was there the sense in which the rationalist's view is a cogent one in the face of the phenomenon of human fallibility, but CCR has to hand a cogent response. If it is asked, but isn't your commitment to reason a non-rational one? Namely, the proponent of CCR can respond that it is not a commitment, but is instead a tentative theory, which is in principle open to criticism. What of criticism of CCR? As far as I know, the main forms of criticism are two. On the one hand, they're criticisms like that of Watkins, in which it's argued that there are formal problems generated by CCR's reflexive or self-referential character. There's a guy called John Post who has written about this at some length and whose papers are reproduced in the Bartley and Radnitsky collection, to which I referred before. As I've suggested above, however, I think that the right tactic to adopt in the face of these is deliberately to adopt a strategy of avoiding them or sidestepping them. Why is this legitimate? Essentially because one is not, as far as I can see, trying to solve problems, for example, like those in set theory, in which what serves to generate these problems plays any essential role. The problem with which we're concerned is one of rationality, not one about logic in any deep sense. One can genuinely strengthen the theory by simply barring anything that generates this kind of problem. Second, there was a criticism that was made by Alan Musgrave. He has, for example, in his collection Essays on Realism and Rationalism, argued that CCR is defective because it suggests that something is rational simply if it's open to criticism. But Musgrave argues the statement, "the moon is made of green cheese," is open to criticism. However, we would hardly say that holding that is rational. Musgrave's point seems to me fine as far as it goes, but on the face of it, all that's needed to respond to it is first to note that Bartley himself had written, and I quote, "A position may be held rationally without needing justification at all, provided that it can be and is open to criticism and survives severe examination." As is to say, our theory of rationality should, as does the general Popperian approach, say that first, our ideas should be open to criticism, they shouldn't yet be refuted, and also that they should meet with the suggestions that Popper made in Truth, Rationality, and the Growth of Knowledge, which I've discussed in earlier lectures. Or, if we're talking about a theory which isn't empirical, be open to criticism in the ways suggested in our earlier discussion of metaphysics. That's to say, by looking at the degree to which they're able to resolve the problems towards which they're directed. I should also add that William Bergson, who did his PhD with Popper, has written a paper criticizing anti-justificationism, which he'll be giving at the second Zoom Popper conference in September 2021. We have had some discussion of it here and alive in emails, but I can't see how it constitutes a criticism of Bartley's approach. You might like to see him speak to the paper at the conference. What about the fruitfulness of CCR? There seem to me three different respects in which CCR is potentially fruitful in the sense of being interesting. There may well be more. First, it serves to highlight clearly the anti-justificationist character of Popper's philosophy, and to suggest that any remaining justificationist elements in it should be removed. I would have thought that that is an interesting and challenging task. It is, as it were, a research program for people interested in critical rationalism. But it then leads to the question, does such an approach really work as a response to, say, MacIntyre's reading of the lessons we should get from Kierkegaard? Does a replacement of justificationism by openness to criticism in fact resolve this key problem of rationality? More generally, one would need to identify and then face up to all non-formalist criticisms that have been made of CCR so far to see if these criticisms can be met. If these issues interest you, David Miller's discussion of CCR in his book, Critical Rationalism, is a good place to start. Second, one might go back to Bartley's original concerns in the philosophy of religion, something in which neither Popper nor Watkins showed any real interest. Does Bartley really manage to resolve the kinds of criticism, or better, responses to criticism, which come out of religious controversy on these issues? Can, as it were, a critical rationalist approach stand not only as a competitor to the religious viewpoints he was discussing, but also as something which has the advantage over them of not requiring a non-rational commitment? Or is it a mistake to see CCR as being a view that a religious person cannot hold? In general, it seems to me that work on critical rationalism and theology has been badly neglected. Although I should here put in a plug for the work of my friend Ali Pear, who from a Muslim perspective has done some interesting work here. Third, there was another line of argument which Bartley investigated, for example, in material added to the second edition of his Retreat to Commitment. This related it to the question of whether there were elements of logic or of argumentative strategy more generally, which needed to be made use of in any criticism, and which themselves couldn't be questioned, just on the grounds that any reasoning about these matters would itself have to make use not just of logic, but of these specific rules of inference. This opens up some very interesting questions, but I don't think that I'm the right person to try to tackle them or to assess the significance of any answer which might be offered. But they certainly seem to me both interesting and well worth pursuing. And again, David Miller's work is on CCR is an interesting starting point here. I'll come now to the final section of the lecture, which relates to Artigas's work on Popper and against Bartley. There's a final line of discussion to which I should refer briefly. A Spanish philosopher, Mariano Artigas, has, in what seems to me a rather strange book, entitled The Ethical Character of Popper's Theory of Knowledge, written on these matters. I will not, in this context, discuss his main concerns, although it seems to me that his title suggests that he's got things completely the wrong way round. For in my view, ethical claims themselves need to be submitted to critical scrutiny. And for that, one needs an epistemology. One can certainly say in relation to Popper that what sparked off his concerns about the evaluation of what makes something scientific was his feeling of personal responsibility for having endorsed Marxism somewhat uncritically, and then people acting on this sort of view having been involved in really a problematic action. Excuse me, I'll be back with you in a second. I must apologize for the delay. I inadvertently touched my keyboard and the notes from which I was speaking disappeared completely from the screen. It won't take me long, but there doesn't seem to be an instant way of getting back to exactly the right point. But I'll continue my discussion of Artigas and things relating to his work in a few minutes, just as quickly as I can. And I was just saying that because ethical claims themselves might be contentious and submitted to critical scrutiny, in that context, one needs an epistemology, and one, I think, needs an epistemology which obviously shouldn't itself make substantive ethical presuppositions, although it's perfectly possible, and Popper has argued this in various points, that we may find that there are ethical consequences from one's epistemological ideas. Artigas also published some comments made by the very elderly Popper, he was about 90 at the time, about Bartley's work on CCR, and then annotated them at some length. They involve in part a repudiation by Popper of the claim that a passage which Bartley criticized in his Open Society can correctly be taken as a statement of the fideistic strand in critical rationalism that Bartley had criticized. I should say that Popper repudiates this reading, but he doesn't actually discuss the passages in question. In part, Popper reports on his having made modifications to some aspects of his book at Bartley's suggestion, indeed using Bartley's own formulations, such that It was strange to him that Bartley continued to take issue with them. One problem about all this is that, as Artigas himself argues, it's more plausible to think of Bartley having made substantive suggestions about Popper's appendix to volume 2 of the Open Society, rather than to the Open Society chapter 4, where that material that I quoted to you comes from. Popper also was exceedingly elderly at the time that he made the comments in question. And my concern would be, on the one hand, that one has to argue here about problems like what is actually implied by the text of what Popper had written, rather than claims about his intentions, and particularly about the intentions of Popper or Bartley made a long while after the material was written. Well, on the other hand, I don't know how good Popper's own memory was at the very end of his life. While I was working for him in the 1970s, his memory was already a little bit patchy. I mean, it's much better than mine is now, but certainly there are sometimes some problems. He had a somewhat disconcerting habit of reconstructing what must have happened at some point in the past in order that what he'd done or what he'd written made sense, and of his reporting this as his memory. I've no reason to suppose that he wasn't acting in good faith, and it's also worth noting that, in fact, Popper's approach simply brings out what seems to be a feature of our memory more generally. That's to say, memory isn't just a matter of veridical recall of information. It involves a great deal of reconstruction. It's also interesting that when Troelzekers Hansen was working on Popper's book, Die beiden Grundprobleme, in the 1970s, this is the first book that Popper wrote, which Hansen edited for publication. Hansen faced the problem that Popper wasn't able to get back into his argument from 40 years before and kept wishing to add notes to his text. Notes which made perfectly good sense from his then current viewpoint in the 1970s, which didn't really fit into the systematic argument that he was offering in Die beiden Grundprobleme. Accordingly, all that I'm saying is that in this case, I think that one needs to look at the argument and what the text actually says, rather than simply at Popper's comments and Artigas' commentary on them. I'd also add that when I was working as Popper's assistant, one problem that I sometimes faced was that I might raise a problem about something that Popper had written, and that rather than explaining why in his judgment I was wrong, or saying, yes, Jeremy, you're completely right about that, we need to change it, Popper would be inclined to make modifications because I was pressing for them. This I found difficult to deal with, just because he's doing this as a kind of subjective personal favor, as it were, was at odds with what I took the critical rationalist approach to be, and with what I would want to happen. I was only concerned that he might change something if actually he was convinced that it wasn't right. All that I conjecture here is that it's possible that Bartley might have run into some of the same issues back when he was working with Popper and suggesting possible changes to the Open Society. And if this was the case, he might not have pressed points with regard to Popper's text in quite the way in which he might have actually wished to do so. I cannot here go into the discussion of the full details of the case that Artigas makes, but it seems to me personally that, first of all, Bartley presented his approach as a development of Popper's, but also as being in tune with what Popper himself often wrote. However, it seems to me that Bartley was right that Popper's presentation in the Open Society, once the issue had been raised, comes over as being fideistic. and that Popper seemed to be attached to his formulation and to presenting what he was talking about as an attitude rather than as a theory that needed to be critically appraised. This comes over very much in the material on which Artigas is commenting. But this seems to me to be something that falls short of what Popper himself has said so often about the importance of articulating attitudes as positions which can be critically appraised. I personally think that Bartley is right that it is the repudiation of justification which is perhaps the key theme in Popper. So conclusions. My own view of CCR is fairly straightforward. I think that there is a genuine problem concerning Popper's views on the status of rationality as set out in the Open Society. I think that Bartley identifies it and offers an important resolution of the problem. I don't know of any telling criticism of CCR, and I personally think that the formalistic issues that have been raised about it are misplaced, and I think that they both can and should be sidestepped. I would say, though, that David Miller, who is much better at formal matters than I think doesn't really take that view. I also think that Bartley, in stressing the non-justificationist character of Popper's approach more generally, was performing a really important service. Not only does it help resolve ambiguities about the interpretation of Popper's work, but in my view, it should lead to a transformation in how we see and do philosophy. I'm struck, for example, by the degree to which people still set out to prove substantive philosophical positions in the sense of trying to justify them. And there is still a lot of work which takes as the paradigm of philosophical argument the derivation of what one wishes to justify from things that are accorded an axiomatic status, where people think that these things are either substantive, self-evident truths, or that somehow they can demonstrate them to be true. It is exactly this from which critical rationalism, if it is interpreted as Bartley has suggested, can, I think, free us. But it is just this claim of which I would be keen to receive substantive criticism. Thank you very much.